He just wanted to clean up his backyard. But when his shovel hit something solid underground, a real nightmare began. A cast-iron bathtub wrapped in chains and completely filled with concrete. And what they found inside after opening it left everyone in shock. Subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments which country you're watching from. Marcus Wells had never imagined that owning a home would feel like this. It was supposed to be a culmination of effort, late nights, stubborn saving, and quiet dreams no one else believed in. For the first time in his life, he stood upon land that truly belonged to him. Not rented, not borrowed, not a room in someone else's house or a cramped apartment where the neighbors' arguments seeped through the walls. This little house on the edge of a small southern town was wholly his. That simple truth filled him with something he had rarely allowed himself to feel: pride. The house itself was plain but solid. A single story of weathered boards and narrow windows that caught the afternoon sun at just the right angle to make the fading paint glow. The roof had seen better years, the gutters needed cleaning, and the front porch creaked if more than one person stood on it. But Marcus loved it. He loved waking up to the sound of birds instead of traffic. He loved the soft breeze that carried the scent of pine from the distant woods. He even loved the silence, the kind that at first made him uneasy, the kind that left him alone with his thoughts. Over time, it had become soothing. The backyard, however, was another story. It was not so much a yard as it was a wild patch of unruly earth, tangled weeds, thick roots twisting just beneath the soil, and patches of dead grass left from years of neglect. It looked like something nature had tried to reclaim. To Marcus, it was a challenge. He wanted a garden. He wanted rows of tomatoes, peppers, and maybe a few fruit trees one day. He pictured a small sitting area where he could drink coffee in the mornings. He saw a possibility where others might only see work. So he worked. Every day after his shift at the auto parts warehouse, he came home, changed into his old clothes, and stepped into the yard with a shovel in hand. He dug, he pulled, he chopped away at the stubborn earth. Sweat soaked through his shirt, dirt caked beneath his fingernails, and the muscles in his arms ached constantly. But each patch of cleared ground felt like a small victory. He moved slowly, but he moved forward. One warm afternoon, after several hours of hacking at twisted roots, his shovel hit something unyielding. The impact shot a jolt up through the handle and into his arms. Marcus paused, narrowed his eyes, and knelt to brush away the dirt. Beneath the thin top layer of soil, something hard and solid glinted faintly. His first thought was that it was a rock, maybe a large one. But the more he cleared away, the more he realized that it wasn't shaped like a rock at all. Curiosity quickened his movements. Marcus dug in wider circles, revealing the faint curvature of metal, smooth and rounded, like a wall rather than a boulder. His shirt stuck to his back as he worked faster, sweat rolling down his temples. The sun dipped lower, shadows stretching long across the yard, but he hardly noticed. He cleared away another section of soil and leaned back on his heels. It was a bathtub, not a modern one either. The thick, rounded edge that emerged from the earth looked old, maybe even antique. He had seen similar shapes in movies set decades earlier, deep-curved tubs of solid iron. The discovery gave him pause. Who buries a bathtub, and why? He decided immediately that he needed to see more. Marcus widened the excavation, exposing more of the strange object. The dirt clung to the edges, but he could clearly make out the heavy structure. And something else. His eyes narrowed as he brushed away another layer of dirt. At first, he thought the dark material wrapped around the tub was just a cluster of roots, but the lines were too smooth, too straight. He leaned closer. Chains. Rusty, thick iron chains wound around the bathtub, several loops of them crossing and knotting together, locked by corroded links that looked as if they had been sealing the tub shut for decades. A strange chill slid across his shoulders despite the heat. This wasn't some discarded junk someone buried to get out of the way. This was deliberate. Someone had taken great effort to confine whatever lay inside. Marcus stared a long moment, heart thudding loudly in his chest. The yard around him grew darker as twilight claimed the sky, but he refused to leave the mystery half buried. He grabbed a flashlight from the porch and returned to the trench, illuminating the tub's edge. As he cleared away more earth, he reached the top rim and froze. The smooth metal surface was marred by deep gouges, sharp and ragged, clawing at the rim from the inside. They were not thin scratches. They were wide, deep, almost desperate, as if something inside had fought to escape. His breath stalled. Every instinct told him to stop, to bury this thing again, pretend he had never found it, and walk inside. Pretend nothing was wrong. But Marcus wasn't someone who turned away from hard truths. Life had rarely allowed him that luxury. The unknown did not scare him easily. Yet tonight, as darkness wrapped around his yard and the old bathtub sat half exposed in the earth like some exhumed relic, unease crept into him like cold water. He wiped his hands on his jeans and stood slowly, his gaze fixed on the chained tub, his mind filled with questions he wasn't sure he wanted answers to. Still, one thing was certain. He had uncovered something buried with intention, something someone once wanted hidden forever. The worn boards of his porch groaned under his feet as he finally stepped away, leaving the bathtub half buried under the heavy chain shadows. He locked his back door carefully that night, checking it twice before he turned off the lights. Sleep came reluctantly, and when it did, it dragged him into uneasy dreams filled with muffled scraping sounds and cold metal beneath his fingertips. Morning light brought a fragile calm. Marcus stood at the kitchen window, sipping weak coffee as he looked out at the yard. The tub was there, real, silent, waiting. As soon as he finished breakfast, he went outside, shovel in hand once again. If he stopped now, fear would take over. If he looked away from the secret beginning to surface on his land, he would never forgive himself. So he kept going. He cleared more soil, now fully aware that whatever he was uncovering might change his life in ways he couldn't yet imagine. The chains clanked under his hands as he exposed the final hidden curves. And when the full shape of the bathtub finally rose from the earth, sealed tight beneath layers of cement and time, Marcus felt something shift inside him. An invisible line crossed. Innocence surrendered. This was no garden project anymore. This was history. This was violence. This was a cry for justice buried in clay and rust. He didn't know the story yet, but he would. He would tear away the dirt layer by layer, the silence inch by inch, until he understood who or what had been trapped here. His yard felt transformed, the air heavier, as though the ground itself held its breath. Marcus straightened up, gripping the edge of the tub, studying the smooth concrete that filled it to the brim. He ran his hand over the rough surface and imagined what could be locked beneath. A strange heaviness pressed on his heart. Something happened here. Someone wanted the world to forget. But the world had a way of revealing what people tried to bury. Marcus Wells had found the first crack, and once a crack appears, no secret can stay hidden forever. Marcus woke up with the weight of the discovery still pressing on his chest. The morning sun bathed his modest kitchen in soft gold, but the light did nothing to lift the heaviness he felt. He barely tasted his breakfast as he chewed, his mind fixed on the chained mass in his backyard. The previous day still felt unreal, like a disturbing dream he should have woken from. Yet the vision of the bathtub lodged in the earth remained vivid. The rusted chains, the deep claw marks that tore into the iron rim, and that silent concrete surface sealing away a truth no one ever wanted uncovered. It was all undeniably real. He set his cup in the sink and let the water run, trying to shake off the sensation crawling beneath his skin. But he knew he would not find rest again until he uncovered more. Marcus laced up his boots, wiped his palms on his jeans, and stepped outside. The air smelled of freshly cut grass from a neighbor's yard, mingling with the damp scent of the earth he had torn open. His backyard, once nothing more than a problem to solve, now stood like a crime scene. The ground surrounding the excavation was uneven, clumps of dirt piled where he had tossed them yesterday. The tub rested in its earthen prison, a grim monument to a secret someone had tried very hard to erase. He walked toward it slowly, as though approaching a sleeping creature that might wake if he moved too quickly. When he reached the edge, he crouched and stared again at the chains. Overnight, the metal had dried, and the rusted lines looked sharper and more menacing in the morning light. He wondered now not only what lay inside, but why someone had taken such desperate measures to not only bury the tub, but reinforce its imprisonment. The thought tightened something in his chest. Marcus paced around the object, studying every inch of what he had exposed. The tub was old, far older than the house or anything else on the property. Thick cast iron, the kind manufacturers hadn't made in generations. The sight sparked an unease that ran deeper than curiosity. He knew history too well, especially the dark parts no one put in textbooks. People had done terrible things under the guise of authority, order, and fear. That darkness had left marks on families like his. And here he was, quite literally, digging up the past with his own hands. He leaned in, brushing away more loose dirt from the rim until his fingers traced smooth metal beside the violent gouges. The scratches cut deep enough to warp the iron itself. They were not made by shovels or tools. Whatever made them had fought hard, driven by terror or agony. Marcus swallowed hard. There was no logical explanation anyone would want to think about. He forced himself to stand and take a step back. The sun rose higher overhead, banishing shadows and leaving no place for fears to hide. He took a long breath, exhaled slowly, and decided he would stop speculating. The truth rested beneath that concrete, and he was going to find it. Digging further around the base seemed pointless. The tub was secured. The real barrier was the thick slab that filled the interior. He needed tools, real tools. It was not possible to crack that open with a simple shovel and blind determination. He rubbed the back of his neck and considered his options. He could call someone, let the police handle it, let them tear it out and investigate. It would be the right thing to do. But a stubborn voice argued inside him. This was his land, his soil, his discovery, and there was something deeply personal in the way the tub had been hidden. This wasn't a matter of luck or coincidence. It felt as though the earth had chosen him to uncover what it had been forced to swallow. Walking away now meant surrendering the truth to strangers who might choose to bury it again, this time under a different kind of silence. Marcus made his decision. He grabbed his truck keys and drove to the hardware supply store on the highway. The place smelled of fresh lumber and fuel, a familiar scent that always brought some comfort. He asked for a rental jackhammer, the clerk giving him a curious look when he explained he needed it to break up some old concrete. It wasn't entirely a lie. He also picked up safety goggles, gloves, and a crowbar. He returned home, parked near the fence, and carried the tools across the yard toward the excavation. Once again, he stood before the tub, now armed like a man preparing to battle something ancient. The rumble of the jackhammer when he switched it on vibrated through his bones. He pressed the bit to the concrete and squeezed the trigger. The tub trembled with each strike. Concrete chips flew and gritty dust clouded the air. The sound was harsh, ripping apart the backyard silence with violent insistence. The first hour yielded little, just shallow fractures that ran like thin lightning across the surface. Marcus pushed harder, refusing to be defeated by stone or history. Sweat poured down his spine, but he barely noticed. What mattered was progress, the cracks widening, deepening, becoming jagged canyons across the once solid block. As the afternoon sun beat down on him, his arms screamed for rest. He paused only long enough to catch his breath and wipe his brow before attacking again. With every blow, the fear within him twisted tighter. If someone went to this extent to encase the contents, then whatever lay inside must have been horrifying or damning or both. He shut off the tool for a moment and leaned forward. His breathing was heavy. Dust coated his lips, dry and bitter. He scanned the cracked surface, now marked with a map of intersecting fractures. He could feel the breakthrough coming. The jackhammer was no longer bouncing harmlessly. It was finding weaknesses. The slab was giving up its hold. When he resumed, it took only minutes before a sharp crack thundered beneath him. The concrete groaned and shifted. He stepped back instinctively. Then a large section broke inward, collapsing with a hollow, echoing thud. But nothing happened next. No smell burst forth. No creature leapt from the darkness. Silence reclaimed the yard as the dust settled. Marcus stared into the exposed interior with wide eyes. Beneath the shattered concrete lay darkness, the kind that suggested too much space, too much unknown. He knelt carefully and brushed away fine gravel, widening the hole until his light could penetrate deeper. He reached for a flashlight he'd brought and flicked it on. The beam revealed something pale and curved. Bones. Human bones. For a moment, the world seemed to tilt under him. The rib cage was visible first, compressed unnaturally as if crushed under the weight of cement. A spine twisted below it, vertebrae still clinging in a grim arrangement. His light trembled as he moved it further down. Smaller bones lay scattered within what must have once been a torso. He couldn't see hands or feet yet, but the shape was unmistakable. There was a person inside the tub. His stomach lurched. He sucked in a breath through clenched teeth, forcing back a wave of nausea and disbelief. The heavy chains, the deep gouges in iron, the effort taken to pour concrete into a bathtub. This had been a burial. No, it was something worse. A burial was a ritual, an act of dignity. This was containment. This was silencing. This was punishment. This was cruelty inflicted by someone who wanted to be certain the victim never saw the sky again. He shivered, though the sun was still hot. His hands shook as he lowered the flashlight further. Pieces of fabric clung to the bones like remnants of a final, futile protection. Near the collapsed center, among the dusty fragments of concrete, something glinted. He reached in, fingers trembling, and plucked the small object free. A delicate chain, tarnished and bent, with a pendant crushed against decayed threads of what once had been clothing. The letters engraved on the tiny metal plate were partial and difficult to read, but he could make out one initial clearly, a J, maybe another letter before it, or after, the rest worn away by time and pressure. Marcus's thoughts spiraled downward into places filled with old anger and generational pain. He knew what this looked like. He knew what this meant. People like him didn't have graves marked with names in the darker years of this country's past. They had holes, or worse, no place at all. Secrets kept so no one would demand justice. He forced himself to pull back before the horror consumed him. He stumbled a few steps away from the excavation, needing space. His lungs struggled to draw breath. He put one hand against the fence, the wood rough under his palm, grounding him while he tried to absorb the truth. There had been a life inside that tub. Someone's son. Someone who breathed and laughed and hoped and had dreams of their own. And someone else decided to steal all of it, then bury the evidence beneath chains and concrete. Marcus closed his eyes and listened to the wind stir through the trees behind the property. The world kept turning, ignorant of what he had found. Yet everything felt changed. He knew this discovery would haunt him forever. There was no turning away now. The dead didn't come to him by accident. He had unearthed their silence, and in doing so, he had inherited everything hidden beneath it. When he opened his eyes again, he felt a shift inside him, something awakening. A responsibility he hadn't asked for but could not deny. This wasn't just a mystery. This was a debt. A story stolen and buried. A truth crying out from bones that should have been allowed to rest under the open sky. Marcus stepped forward again, slower this time. He knelt beside the tub and brushed dirt gently from the exposed ribs with his hand, an unspoken vow in his heart. He would not leave this secret to rot beneath the soil. He would find out who this person was and what had happened. He would drag the truth into daylight even if it fought him every step of the way. He looked up at the sky, blue and cloudless, and felt the sun warm his face, steadying his resolve. Somewhere out there were records, memories, answers. He didn't know what dangers such knowledge might bring, but fear was a luxury he no longer permitted himself. Someone had fought desperately to claw their way out of this tub. He would fight just as hard to set their story free. Marcus stood tall, his shadow falling across the bathtub like a promise. He would go to the library, the courthouse. He would comb through old newspapers, ask the questions no one wanted to hear. This was no longer about curiosity or land improvement. His life had changed the moment his shovel struck that iron rim. And there was no going back. With one last look into the darkness of the tub, Marcus turned toward his house to wash up. His every step felt heavy, not with dread this time, but with purpose. The dead had waited long enough. Their silence would finally be broken. Sleep did not come easily that night. Marcus lay awake for hours, staring at the dim ceiling as though answers might appear in the plaster above him. The house was quiet, but his mind was far too loud. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the broken surface of concrete, the jagged fragments surrounding bones that had waited decades for someone to stumble upon their tomb. He saw the dark gouges on the iron rim, imagined the terror that had driven someone to claw at unbreakable metal until their strength gave out forever. Those marks told a story of desperation that words could never fully capture. Whoever had been buried inside that tub had not gone willingly. At some point, exhaustion dragged him into a restless sleep. When he woke, the sun was already up, filtering through the blinds in slanted lines of pale yellow. For a moment, he forgot. The morning felt almost normal. But then memory returned in a cold rush, and the weight settled over him again. Today, he would begin the next step. Today, the secret would start to unravel. He brewed coffee that tasted more like necessity than comfort and stood at the kitchen window staring out at the excavation. The tub sat like a wound carved into the earth, the cracked concrete revealing darkness within. He knew he couldn't just stare from a distance forever. He forced himself outside, mug still in hand, the grass damp against his feet as he crossed the yard. Standing on the edge again, he studied the skeleton in the dim recess, lit by the morning sun. There was something reverent in the way he set his mug aside and knelt to get a closer look. He felt like an intruder trespassing into the past, yet also like the only person willing to answer its plea. The pendant he had found lay where he had placed it on the grass the night before, still covered in a fine layer of dust. Marcus picked it up again, turning it slowly in his fingers. The tiny engraved letter, J, caught the light. The identity might be hidden now, but identities could be recovered. Someone had known this person once. Someone had mourned when they never came home. Marcus took a shaky breath and pushed himself back to his feet. Today was not about grief. It was about information. He walked back inside, grabbed his wallet and keys, and headed toward his truck. As he drove into town, every street, every passing face seemed to hide a secret. Did anyone know what was buried on his land? Had someone hoped it would stay buried until they were long gone? The thought made his grip tighten on the steering wheel. The library was a small brick building with white trim and a faded sign offering local history resources in peeling letters. Inside, the air was still and cool, scented faintly with old pages and dust. It reminded Marcus of school days spent in quiet corners, burying himself in books to escape a world that didn't always want him in it. He approached the reference desk, trying to keep his voice steady as he explained that he was interested in town archives, especially older newspapers, any reports about missing people from the mid-20th century. The librarian, a soft-spoken woman with glasses perched on the bridge of her nose, gave him a curious but kind look and led him to a back room. Microfilm reels, stacks of local history journals, a bulky machine that hummed faintly when he turned it on. Marcus sat down and began to scroll through decade after decade of headlines. Most were mundane: town picnics, school plays, store openings, church events. But occasionally, a darker story appeared. A boy gone missing on his way home from work. A young man last seen walking near the train station. A teenager who vanished during summer break. Each article was brief, sometimes no more than a paragraph. There were never follow-ups, never answers. The words felt cold, uncaring, as though even the printed ink refused to linger too long on the tragedies of people the world preferred to ignore. Hours passed. His eyes ached from squinting at the old screens, but he pushed forward. The dates he found corresponded eerily well with the style of clothing found in the tub. And the pendant. Yes, the J could have belonged to any number of missing sons. Or perhaps it was the first letter of a last name, not a first. That widened the possibilities. Yet patterns emerged in his mind, the clustering of disappearances in the very outskirts of town. Several occurred along dirt roads that existed long before housing developments crept outward, along roads not far from where he now lived. Marcus paused to rub his temples, a knot of dread tightening inside him. These weren't isolated incidents. They formed a history, a buried one. He scribbled notes on a pad, listing names and dates, hoping that comparisons might reveal something. The list grew longer than he anticipated. Entire columns of vanished young men from the same era, nearly all of them black. He leaned back in his chair, heart sinking. He had always known the town had its shadows. It was impossible not to. Whispers of old injustices passed through generations like folk tales told with half a smile and eyes that never quite met your own. But seeing the proof laid out before him, this many missing, turned suspicion into a sick certainty. The librarian approached to inform him the library would close soon. Startled by the sudden intrusion of the present into his dive through the past, Marcus gathered his notes and thanked her with a strained smile. He left with a heavy binder of photocopies and a head full of names of people whose final moments might have resembled the horror etched into the iron in his backyard. Dusk had settled by the time he returned home. The yard felt different again, less like his and more like sacred ground where souls had not been allowed to rest. He sat on the back steps, binder open on his lap, and stared into the darkening sky. Somewhere in those pages might be the identity of the person in the tub. Somewhere there might be a clue to why this cruelty had been carried out, and who had carried it out. A part of him trembled at the thought of what pursuing the truth might uncover. People capable of burying someone alive in chains and concrete were not people who welcomed exposure. If they, or their descendants, still lived in this town, would they let him continue digging, both literally and figuratively? He looked toward the house behind his yard, where an elderly man lived alone, and then toward the street, where he had earlier passed a group of neighbors chatting on a porch. Their eyes had tracked his truck with quiet curiosity. Had they known? Did they suspect what lay hidden beneath his yard? The silence of the neighborhood felt suddenly less like peace and more like a warning. Marcus stood and walked to the excavation once again. The evening air cooled against his skin. He retrieved the flashlight from his workbench and shone it into the tub. The bones lay undisturbed, silent, but they spoke loudly in his mind. He needed help. Maybe the police. Maybe historians. But what if the authorities dismissed him? What if they tried to take control? To box everything up, declare it solved, and allow the past to sink back into oblivion again? His jaw tightened. No, he wasn't ready to hand this over, not until he understood more. So he decided he would keep going. He would expand the dig around the tub to see if there was more. If this was only the beginning. The thought horrified him, yet he could not deny the logic. The town's history had shown too many disappearances for a single tub to explain. It was entirely possible, no, likely, that there were others. He set down the flashlight and stared into the hole as crickets began to chirp around him. The night seemed to lean in closer, as though waiting for his next move. He felt the gravity of the task ahead, how deep the roots of this secret ran. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. Someone had tried to erase this story. They failed. Marcus Wells had become its keeper now. The dead would not be ignored any longer. Night clung to Marcus like a second skin, restless and unwelcoming. Even after he finally forced himself into bed, his body refused to relax. His mind kept circling the same grim realization. What he had uncovered was not an isolated crime. It was a fragment of something larger, a single scream smothered in the dark, while countless others might still lie unheard beneath the soil. The images from the library flashed behind his closed eyes. The names of the missing, the brief, dismissive headlines, the cruel silence that followed each one. He saw the bones again. The chain, the initial J, trembling in the beam of his flashlight like a plea from beyond the grave. Sometime before dawn, he drifted into a troubled sleep, but by the time sunlight seeped into the room, his restlessness returned with full force. He sat on the edge of his bed and rubbed his face, feeling older than he was. He couldn't let the day slip by without action. The truth was close enough to taste, bitter as old rust. He went outside after a cup of lukewarm coffee and stood, gripped by a moment of hesitation. The bathtub lay silent and unmoving, a dark mouth waiting for answers to tumble into it. Marcus climbed into the hole and examined the broken concrete again. His flashlight beam glinted off the bones. He imagined the moment the slab had sealed over them, extinguishing all hope. The thought made his chest ache sharply. He lowered himself deeper into the excavation to remove a few of the larger chunks of loose concrete. Every movement felt like a trespass, but he treated the remains with as much reverence as possible. He didn't shift the bones or disturb their position any more than necessary. Instead, he widened the opening carefully, hoping to expose enough of the figure to identify more clues. When he reached what he believed to be the upper arm, he noticed something embedded beneath the concrete dust. A twist of metal dug deep into bone. A steel cable looped twice. A restraint. Confirming without question that the hands had been bound long after the victim lost the ability to fight. He staggered back, swallowing hard. Whoever had done this had gone to meticulous lengths to ensure suffering. This was not murder born of haste or panic. This was punishment. It sickened him. Marcus climbed out of the hole and sat heavily on the grass. The breeze rustled the trees around him, bringing scents of summer and life into a moment thick with the memory of death. He closed his eyes and breathed deeply. He had responsibilities. He had a job. He had bills to pay. But none of that felt as urgent as the story locked in those bones. If he didn't fight for that lost soul, who would? He could no longer ignore what logic had already told him. A single victim did not justify a burial apparatus like this. If a killer, or killers, had needed a place to hide one body, they might have chosen somewhere far more discreet than a bathtub sealed in concrete. The tub was repurposed. It was a container, not a coffin. And if there was one, there could be more. He felt cold at the thought. Determined, Marcus picked up his shovel and began to dig outward from the sides of the tub, creating a larger perimeter. His muscles ached almost immediately from the strain, but he continued without pause. Sweat dripped down his spine and soaked the collar of his shirt. He lost track of time, the yard gradually transforming into a widening pit. As he dug, the sound of his shovel striking metal cut through the monotony with a sharp, hollow tone. He froze. Slowly, he scraped away the dirt in a wide arc until another shape began to emerge. The edge was familiar. The curve was undeniable. Another tub. Fear tried to wrap its fingers around his resolve, but he yanked free from its grip. He moved to the opposite side of his excavation, dread swelling as the shovel struck metal again. The third time, the certainty solidified into horror rather than surprise. 3 bathtubs, 3 hidden graves, 3 victims, perhaps more. He hadn't even cleared the full breadth of the backyard. Marcus stumbled backward and dropped to the ground. His heart pounded violently, echoing in his ears like a warning drum. This wasn't coincidence. This was wide-scale, methodical brutality. He sat there, staring at the shapes he'd unearthed, the grim pattern revealing itself one tub at a time, a field of the dead beneath his feet. In the stillness of his shock, a new realization crept over him. The detail he had been too focused to notice earlier suddenly seemed glaring. His own home, the place he fought so hard to afford, had been built on these secrets. It wasn't simply that he owned the property where one forgotten victim was laid to rest. He lived atop a burial ground engineered by hands that never intended anyone to discover the truth. The thought struck him with a suffocating weight. He rose slowly and walked to the fence. The neighborhood around him looked unchanged. Cars passed occasionally. Somewhere, a child called out in play. The town church bell chimed the hour in the distance. Life carried on blind to the despair beneath his land. Blind, or uninterested. His phone felt heavy in his pocket. Should he call the police? Surely he should, but something in his gut told him to pause. If the crimes were connected to old powers in this town, authorities, men whose influence stretched across generations, bringing them in now might only smear mud over the truth. Officials might label the remains as historical but irrelevant, push them aside as relics of a past better forgotten. They might even claim rights over the investigation and force Marcus away entirely. Another silencing. He glanced to the neighbors' houses again. Some watched him too closely. Some avoided looking his way altogether. He didn't trust any of them. Marcus returned to the tub that began it all. He turned on his flashlight once more and crouched low, studying the remains. A fragment of cloth, deep brown and decayed, still clung to one shoulder. The fabric looked like a part of a shirt, sturdy, simple, likely work clothes. The shoes were gone, if they had ever been put in with the body at all. He leaned further inside to examine the chain marking, that J. He tried to imagine the boy or man who once wore it. Did he fight back when they grabbed him? Did he call out for someone who never came? Maybe he'd simply been walking home when headlights blinded him and strong hands clamped down. Marcus's stomach churned. This happened to someone whose only crime was existing in the wrong place at the wrong time, and likely the wrong skin color. Marcus had spent his whole life aware of that unwritten rule, but he had never imagined he would uncover its most horrifying consequence in his own backyard. A rustle of wind skimmed over the pit, sending loose dust swirling through the air like ghosts shifting in their sleep. Marcus leaned back and sat on his heels, gripping the rim of the tub. He felt that same force that had driven him since the first strike of his shovel, the duty to finish what he had started, to give names back to the nameless, to break chains that death had failed to sever. He climbed out and stood amid the disturbed soil. His shadow stretched long over the growing excavation as the sun began its descent. He glanced toward the forest beyond the property line, the trees swaying like silent witnesses. Maybe they had seen everything decades ago. Maybe they had watched the crime unfold under different stars. The weight of what came next pressed relentlessly upon him. He could not stop now. He could not turn away. His hands, his heart, his conscience, every part of him was bound to these buried lives just as tightly as the chains that still clung to their bones. As night began to claim the sky, Marcus stood alone in his backyard. Beneath him, the dead waited. Around him, the past braced to fight for its secrecy. And in him, a fire of determination burned hotter than fear. He whispered into the dark, not as a man terrified of what his land might reveal, but as a man who would no longer allow silence to smother the truth. He would free every one of them, even if those who buried the bodies came looking for him next. Morning light crept across Marcus's floorboards like a quiet intruder, but he was awake long before it appeared. His body ached from digging, his head ached from thinking, and his heart ached from what he had seen. But none of that mattered compared to the need that drove him now. He dressed without hesitation, the motions automatic, as though his limbs had accepted their new purpose long before his mind did. When he stepped outside, the cool air hit him sharp and clean, clearing away the remnants of sleep. His backyard looked even more scarred in daylight, a patch of wounded earth bearing the open mouths of graves disguised as bathtubs. The sight churned his stomach and steeled his resolve all at once. Whatever had been done here, whoever had been buried here, deserved more than silence. The skeleton in the first tub could not speak for itself, but the remnants left behind could. The pendant with the lone initial J, the thick cable biting into bone, the fabric clinging stubbornly to dust. These were clues waiting for someone who cared enough to notice them. Marcus was that person now. Whether by fate or cruel coincidence, the responsibility had fallen to him. He pulled out the notes he had taken at the library the day before, pages filled with names of young black men who had vanished between 1948 and 1965. Some of the articles included brief family pleas, printed as small side features beneath advertisements for grocery stores and charity events. "If anyone has information," they had begged. But the pleas faded, replaced by new headlines that did not care. Marcus sat at his kitchen table and spread the papers out. He studied every face he had photocopied, every name written in old ink. The decades between them and now felt both massive and razor-thin. These could be the men under his yard. Their mothers and fathers had lived their entire lives not knowing what happened. He felt a heaviness in his chest thinking of the families, people sitting at dinner tables in quiet despair, staring at doors that never opened again. He found himself whispering small apologies he knew would never be heard. When he finished reviewing his notes again, he grabbed his truck keys. The library held many answers, but he needed more than newspapers. He needed records, birth certificates, police reports, something official that linked a missing person to something tangible. That meant going to the county records office. A part of him worried about drawing attention to himself, but the victim deserved recognition. Even if the world wanted to forget, he would force it to remember. The county building was older, built in a time when brick design was meant to feel imposing rather than welcoming. Inside, the hallway smelled faintly of bleach and aging paperwork. Marcus approached a receptionist who wore a polished smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. He explained that he was doing family research and hoped to look at archives from the mid-20th century. The woman raised an eyebrow but nodded and directed him down a corridor. A storage room filled with filing cabinets and dust awaited him, rows of drawers stretching like tombs of forgotten information. He signed his name in a ledger and was left alone to dig through the town's past with his bare hands. Cabinet after cabinet, folder after folder, Marcus searched. He found police reports so thin they felt like insults. Cases closed without investigation. The missing listed as runaways, despite statements from loved ones insisting otherwise. One boy, age 17, described as responsible, hard-working, last seen leaving his job at a mill. Another, 22, disappeared walking home from night school. A younger one, just 14, vanished after a Sunday service. All black, all forgotten. The anger simmered in Marcus like a storm swelling behind closed doors. Rage at the people who had done this. Rage at the people who had looked away. Rage at a system that had never considered these lives worthy of justice. He forced himself to breathe, focus. There was something else here, a detail that scratched at his attention. One report documented a sighting of a missing man's clothing found near an abandoned section of land. The location was roughly near where his neighborhood now stood. The report mentioned no further evidence observed and was swiftly closed. Marcus wrote down the officer's name. The signature carried weight even across time. Maybe that man was still alive, or maybe his descendants were. Marcus pulled another folder, and another. Each new page peeled back a layer of rot long hidden beneath a pleasant southern facade. A name repeated several times: McMillan. An old family with influence that had woven through local politics, law enforcement, and business ownership for generations. The McMillans had always been spoken of with reverence in town, as if they had built it single-handedly. Marcus wasn't sure what that meant yet, but something inside him flagged the name like a quiet alarm. His eyes scanned further until he found a file dated 1952, a missing man named Joseph. A pendant engraved with the initial J described in the possession notice. Marcus's pulse quickened. The man, Joseph Carter, had been 26, last seen heading home from his job at a logging site on the outskirts of town. His mother reported him missing the next day. There was no follow-up listed. The report ended in silence. Joseph. The initial, J. Marcus, set the file down and stared at the name. It wasn't absolute proof, but it was a direction. A life he could return to the bones beneath his yard. The weight of that possibility made his throat tighten. He copied the details carefully. Then he closed the cabinet drawers and left the office, feeling the weight of invisible eyes lingering on him as he walked through the hall. It might have been imagination or paranoia, but something in the air shifted when he passed the receptionist on his way out. Her smile seemed tighter, her voice too sweet when she told him to have a blessed day. Marcus kept walking. The parking lot felt too open, exposed, as though anyone could be watching. He climbed into his truck and started the engine, gripping the steering wheel harder than necessary. The thought crept into his mind that he might now be on someone's radar, someone who didn't want old truths resurfacing. Driving home, he noticed his neighbor standing on their porch, arms folded. The man watched Marcus's truck roll up the driveway, his expression stiff and unreadable. Marcus nodded out of courtesy. The neighbor didn't nod back. Inside the house, Marcus locked the door and set the papers on the table once more. He stared down at the name Joseph Carter, picturing the skeleton beneath the concrete. A life erased, but not entirely. Marcus felt that someone's spirit might finally stir, aware that after 70 years someone cared enough to look. He returned to the yard as the sun hung low, casting long shadows. The air smelled faintly of earth and iron. He stood at the edge of the pit again and whispered the name he had learned, unsure if the wind might carry it somewhere it needed to go. "Joseph," he said quietly. For a moment, the world felt breathless. Marcus knelt beside the tub, his hand resting lightly on the rim. He imagined Joseph as he once was, young, strong from working long hours, laughing with friends, loving a family that missed him fiercely. Then he imagined the terror of that night, those final moments when hope was cut and the world sealed shut above him. A death meant to be erased. But Joseph had been found. Not by the police, not by those in power who had chosen to forget, but by someone who believed that every story mattered, even the ones others tried to bury. Marcus's voice was steadier when he spoke again. "You're not going to be forgotten anymore." The breeze picked up, swirling dust gently from the exposed opening like a sigh. As night settled again, he left the pit only when darkness forced him inside. He washed the dirt from his hands, but no amount of water could wash away the images etched into his mind. He ate little for dinner, and he barely slept. His dreams were filled with shadows of men he had never met but now felt responsible for. They stood beside him, silent but watchful, urging him to continue, to pull up the truth, bone by bone. By morning, Marcus's purpose was no longer a choice. It was part of him. He didn't know who might oppose him or how far they would go to stop him, but what terrified him more was imagining doing nothing, imagining the earth swallowing those stories again, imagining stepping over the graves in his yard every day, pretending he didn't know what lay beneath. For Marcus Wells, pretending was no longer an option. The dead had waited long enough. Marcus woke before sunrise, his sleep shallow and fragmented. The quiet hum of early morning usually brought peace, but now it only amplified the tension coiling deep within him. He moved through his house like a man trying not to wake something dangerous. Every floorboard creak echoed too loudly. Every shadow seemed to stretch and watch him. He brushed his teeth, dressed, poured himself a cup of coffee, but none of the simple motions made the world feel normal again. He stepped outside, coffee warm in his palms, and the air greeted him cool and still. A soft mist hovered above the grass, and the sky was painted in faint streaks of gray and gold. Under any other circumstance, the moment might have been beautiful. Instead, his gaze was pulled instantly to the wounded soil where the bathtubs lay like open caskets waiting. He moved closer and stood at the edge of the excavation, the ground beneath his boots shifting slightly, reminding him how fragile the barrier was between life and death here. He felt no sense of triumph at the progress he had made. He felt the burden of responsibility growing heavier with each discovery. One life uncovered was enough to shake him. 3 made it impossible to breathe easily. He thought of Joseph Carter, a name once spoken with love, then grief, then eventually swallowed by silence. Marcus whispered the name again under his breath, feeling that speaking it was an act of defiance against the decades of erasure. The wind responded with a faint rustle of leaves, like a quiet acknowledgement. Marcus needed more answers. He had gathered fragments of truth, but the story was still murky, like a reflection in dirty water. And he was beginning to suspect that the danger of pursuing clarity was no longer just a distant concern. The receptionist at the county office, the neighbor's cold stare, the growing quietness that seemed to follow him. The truth was a threat to those who had buried it, and threats were never ignored for long. He tightened his jacket and walked toward the fence separating his yard from the neighbor's. The house next door belonged to Mr. Adams, a retired man with stiff posture and a yard kept in pristine condition. Marcus had always assumed he was simply unfriendly, perhaps protective of his privacy. But now, as Marcus replayed yesterday's moment, the unmoving stare when he returned from the records office, he felt something darker behind the man's gaze. A warning, maybe, or recognition. Mr. Adams was outside now, trimming his hedges even though they were already perfect. Marcus cleared his throat and approached, trying to appear casual. "Morning," Marcus said. The older man paused mid-cut, his jaw tightening as though the greeting itself offended him. He turned his head slightly, but not enough to meet Marcus's eye. "You're doing a lot of digging over there," Adams muttered, keeping his focus on his clippers. "Making a real mess of things." Marcus swallowed the irritation rising in him. "Just trying to clean up the yard," he said, forcing calm. "There were some buried things I didn't expect." The clippers stopped. Adams turned fully now, his eyes sharp and cold. "Some things ought to stay buried," he said. The words felt like a door slamming shut. Marcus held the man's stare, but Adams turned away and resumed trimming as though conversation was over. Marcus walked back slowly, every step heavier than the last. His pulse thudded hard in his ears. The message was clear. Someone knew. Someone wanted him to stop. But fear no longer had the power to turn him around. It only pushed him forward. Marcus returned to the house and scanned his notes again. The name McMillan appeared repeatedly, shadowing the town's history. A family once powerful and wealthy, with relatives in law enforcement, banking, and local government. Men who had written the rules and bent them at will. Men who might have believed the world would always operate according to their design. Joseph Carter's police report had been signed by Deputy Daniel McMillan. A McMillan had been sheriff during several other disappearances. Marcus scribbled the connections out on paper like a conspiracy chart, lines crossing and intersecting until a clearer picture emerged. This was not random. It was systemic. Marcus tapped his pen against the table. If the McMillans were involved, everything in this town, from who prospered to who vanished, could trace back to them. The question was no longer why these crimes happened, but why the perpetrators were never held accountable. And the answer was likely alive and well. Later that afternoon, Marcus decided to make another effort to understand who in the neighborhood might know the truth. He walked down the street, past homes lined neatly with trimmed lawns and American flags fluttering in the breeze. He knocked on a few doors, asking polite questions about the history of the land where his house sat. Most responses were vague or evasive. People shrugged, looked away, or changed the subject quickly. But one neighbor, an older woman named Mrs. Turner, paused after hearing his question. Her wrinkled hands tightened around the edge of her screen door. Her pale eyes darted nervously down the street before she spoke in a whisper. "You should forget whatever you found," she said. "The dead don't need your help, and the living don't take kindly to old wounds being reopened." Marcus leaned closer, his voice barely above a breath. "Did you know Joseph Carter?" Her face drained of color. For a moment, she seemed to buckle under the weight of old memories. "I knew of him," she replied shakily. "Everyone did. He was a good man. They said he ran off." She lowered her eyes. But nobody believed that. She glanced past Marcus again, fear rising in her expression. Then she stepped back. "Don't ask me anything else," she whispered. "Please, for your own sake." She shut the door before he could respond. Marcus stood still, heart pounding hard. Every warning only fueled his resolve. If the truth scared them this much, that meant he was getting close. As dusk bled slowly across the sky, Marcus returned home with shadows gathering beneath his eyes. He locked the door behind him, his breaths uneven. The house seemed too quiet now, every creak and groan magnified in the silence. He checked each window, making sure the locks were secure. The paranoia creeping over him felt almost physical, like fingertips brushing across the back of his neck. He tried to rest, but as darkness settled fully, noises stirred outside. Soft footsteps pressed against the grass. A low murmur of voices. Marcus moved cautiously toward the back door, his heart hammering. He peered through the blinds. Figures stood near the excavation. Dim silhouettes, 2, maybe 3. Flashlights swept slowly across the yard, pausing at the first bathtub as if confirming something. Marcus froze, his body rigid. They knew. They were here. And they wanted to make sure the past stayed buried. One of the flashlights turned toward the house and Marcus dropped behind the counter, breath caught in his throat. He waited, chest tight, every second stretching painfully. The voices quieted. Then, after a long moment, footsteps retreated. The lights vanished. Silence returned. Only after several minutes did Marcus dare to lift his head. He crept back toward the window. The yard was empty again, but not the same. His sanctuary had been violated. His work had been watched. And whoever it was had left with intention, not fear. Marcus backed away slowly and slid down the wall to the floor, pulse still racing. He pressed a hand to his chest as though forcing his heart to stay inside his rib cage. The warning was clear. Stop, or we'll stop you. His fear burned, but within it grew another sensation, rage. He clenched his jaw until it hurt. These people, or their descendants, had taken lives and buried their crimes. They dared to intimidate him into helping them maintain their lies. He whispered the name again, like a vow. Joseph. Then other names followed, names from his notes, names from newspapers, names that had no justice attached to them. Carter, Lee, Bryant, Harris. Each one became another reason to keep going. Marcus stood, feeling the fire inside him blaze higher than the fear. He knew the risks now. He knew the enemy was not in the distant past, but right outside his fence. Watching. Waiting. Ready to protect their legacy of silence. But he also knew something else. Secrets had a way of unraveling once a single thread was pulled, and Marcus had already torn out handfuls of them. Tomorrow he would keep digging, even if the town itself rose against him. Even if those who once wielded power returned to finish what they started. For the first time in decades, the dead were no longer alone. Marcus didn't sleep that night. Not after the shadows moved through his yard and vanished into the tree line like ghosts wearing human faces. He sat in his living room with every light off, staring through the window at the darkness outside. His hands were curled into fists on his knees, knuckles white, blood pulsing hot beneath his skin. Fear pressed close, whispering that one man could not stand against a legacy of buried violence. But something deeper, stronger, refused to break. The bones in his yard had waited 70 years. He would not fail them now. By the time dawn crept into the sky, Marcus was exhausted but unwavering. He walked outside as the first rays of sun spilled across the ground, illuminating the pit like a stage set for truth. The excavation yawned wide, exposing the horror below, yet also the possibility of justice rising from the dirt. The grass was flattened where the night visitors had stood. Their footprints remained faint but visible in the morning dew. They had inspected the graves and chosen to leave him alive. For now. Perhaps they thought a warning would be enough to keep him obediently silent. They didn't know him. He gripped the shovel, leaning against the fence, and stepped down into the pit. His body protested. The hours of digging, the lack of rest, the tension coiled in every muscle. Everything ached. But he forced himself to continue, widening the trench around the newly discovered bathtubs. Dirt gave way slowly, stubbornly, as though trying to protect the monsters who had placed these tombs here. Marcus tore through it, sweat dripping from his chin, heart pounding to a steady rhythm of defiance. Minutes bled into hours. The sun climbed high. He uncovered more of the iron shapes. A third tub emerged fully. A fourth began to take form beneath his blade. His lungs burned with each breath. His back screamed in complaint. Yet he continued, driven by rage and grief and the unstoppable belief that truth must not remain hidden. As he wiped the back of his hand across his forehead, removing a river of sweat and soil, a sound carried across the fence. A distant door slammed. Tires crunching gravel, a truck engine turned over. He paused, listening. The noise faded quickly. Perhaps someone leaving for work, or perhaps someone reporting back to whoever had visited his yard during the night. He turned his attention downward once more. As he dug near the third tub, a shovel struck metal. not curved like the others, but flat. He crouched quickly and brushed away dirt with his bare hands. A rectangular metal tag lay pressed against the tub's exterior, rusted but still bearing faint stamped letters. He squinted, trying to decipher the worn markings. A name. No, not a full name. An abbreviation, possibly a serial number or identification tag. Proof that these were not random household items buried for convenience. Proof someone had a system. Marcus's pulse hammered harder. His hands trembled as he placed the tag into his pocket, knowing it could lead to more answers. He lifted his gaze, scanning the yard again. The sense of being watched crept beneath his skin, prickling the back of his neck. He stood up slowly, keeping quiet, as though movement alone could alert the eyes he suspected were observing him. But he saw nothing. Only the wind bending blades of grass and the sun casting long shadows from the trees. The silence felt heavier than footsteps would have. He kept working anyway. Eventually, hunger gnawed its way into him, forcing him inside the house. He washed up at the kitchen sink, soil swirling down the drain like diluted blood. He poured a glass of water and drank it all in one go, throat sore and dry. The house felt oppressive, walls closing in with unspoken warnings. He grabbed his notes and sat at the table, comparing the metal tag with his paperwork. The partial identification on the tag might match equipment logs used by construction companies decades ago. If the tubs came from a commercial source, he could trace shipments, track orders, find those responsible. A knock shattered the silence. Marcus froze, breath trapped in his lungs. The knock came again, firm, uninvited. He set his papers down quietly and moved to the door, adrenaline surging through him. Through the peephole, he saw a polished badge and a pressed uniform. The county sheriff stood on his porch, hat pulled low over his brow. The man raised his fist to knock again. Marcus unlocked the door but only cracked it open a few inches. "Morning," the sheriff said, voice smooth but edged with something too practiced. "We've had some concerns raised about your digging. Thought I'd stop by, see what's going on." Marcus kept his grip tight on the door. "I'm working on my yard." The sheriff's smile didn't touch his eyes. "That's so? Someone said you found something out there, something unusual." "Just junk," Marcus lied. The sheriff glanced past him toward the backyard, gaze sharp. "Mind if I take a look?" Marcus hesitated, heart pounding. Inviting law enforcement into the investigation could destroy everything. The sheriff noticed the pause and his smile thinned. "Unless you have something to hide," he said softly. Marcus swallowed hard. "I'd feel better if you had a warrant." The sheriff's jaw twitched. The smile vanished entirely. For a moment, the air chilled between them. "You let me know if you find anything," he said, stepping back from the door. "Anything at all." He turned and walked to his cruiser, boots heavy on the gravel. The engine roared to life, and the vehicle pulled away slowly, headlights lingering a fraction too long on Marcus's home as it departed. Marcus shut the door and leaned against it, his whole body trembling. The sheriff's tone haunted him. Not protective, not helpful, threatening. The man wasn't trying to protect the town from danger. He was protecting the town from truth. As evening fell, Marcus retreated into his yard again. The dusk breeze cooled his sweat, making goosebumps rise across his arms. He continued to dig around the fourth tub until he uncovered enough of its edge to confirm it mirrored the others. He wondered in horror how many more lay buried beneath the land. 5? 10? Hundreds? How many lives had been stolen so quietly that the earth alone remembered? Voices echoed behind his shoulder, low, hushed, tense. His heart jolted. He turned quickly, seeing only silhouettes retreating behind a fence. Shadows watched him. Shadows whispered. Shadows waited. Marcus climbed out of the pit and stood tall despite the fear crawling beneath his skin. He looked across the neighborhood with new understanding. The enemy wasn't hidden far away. It was here, in the houses with freshly painted shutters, in the smiles that avoided his eyes, in the people who tended their gardens while pretending their soil wasn't fertilized with secrets. He walked to the center of his yard and stared down into the graves he had opened. The skeletons inside, Joseph and the others, deserved more than a quiet uncovering. They deserved names restored and voices returned. Marcus felt a shift within him, a breaking point tipping toward action. He could no longer simply dig and research. He needed to expose everything, loudly, publicly, before he became just another body sealed in iron and buried under lies. He stepped away from the pit, boots sinking into the softened earth. The sun slipped fully behind the horizon, plunging the yard into deep blue shadow. Marcus heard a twig snap near the edge of his property. He spun, shovel clutched like a weapon, but nothing moved. Nothing visible anyway. The darkness felt alive. He backed slowly toward the house, eyes fixed on the yard, refusing to turn his back. When he reached his steps, he paused. One final look at the excavation. The breeze stirred dust from the open graves, and for a moment it seemed as though a sigh rose from the earth. Relief, gratitude, hope. "You're not alone anymore," he whispered. Then came the unmistakable sound behind him. A footstep. Close. Too close. Marcus turned. Breath caught halfway in his throat. A figure stood not 10 feet away, face hidden by darkness, body motionless like a grave marker risen from the dirt. The figure took a single step forward, and the gravel crunched beneath their boot. Marcus tightened his grip on the shovel. Even in the darkest, one can find a spark of courage. He stared straight into the shape of whoever had finally come for him. The buried truths were rising, and the living would have to decide whether they would face them, or be swallowed by them. Marcus stood ready, because some things should never stay buried. Don't let this story end here. Hit subscribe so you never miss what happens next, and dive into our other shocking investigations. Share this video with someone who needs to see the truth.